Hello, this is Brian. Welcome back to my shop. Today I want to talk to you about horsepower ratings on power tools. Specifically how you're getting misled when you buy benchtop power tools. You get misled on the horsepower rating of these motors. And the problem seems like it's getting worse over time. Now, to be clear, in today's video, I'm going to say how you're getting misled when you're buying tools. I'm not going to say ripped off. So if I say ripped off, I'm sure the marketing departments from the two companies which I'm going to use as examples today will get angry. I'm going to focus on benchtop drill presses and benchtop bandsaws. I have a lot of both. I'm going to focus on Grizzly and Delta. Those are the brands that I have the most of. I'm going to focus on old and new. And remember, for me, new means 20 years old. Old is 30 years old. And to be fair to each company, I'm going to say something good and something negative about each one, because they have their pluses and minuses. And it really seems like it's age dependent. To back up my claim, I'm going to use examples from Engineering Toolbox, examples of what a fractional horsepower motor should have for an amp draw rating. I'm going to use examples from my motor collection. I have a pretty extensive motor collection. And then finally, we're going to wrap up by going into a catalog and looking at brand new tools, and we'll see how the problem has really gotten worse. So that's an awful lot to talk about. I do want to make a joke first, though. Somebody commented if I always wear the same shirts. And I'm going to answer, yeah, it's like Hollywood. I wear the same thing for continuity. I'm claiming continuity. You know, just Bonanza and Gilligan's Island, the men always wear the same thing. It's for continuity. Haha. Jokes aside, let's start with drill presses. Here we go. Here we are out in the garage. I'm going to start with this Grizzly benchtop drill press. If you watch my channel, last week I made a video on this one because I put this start relay on because the motor didn't really have enough power to start, especially in the wintertime when the belt was cold and stiff. What a difference this has made. But putting this relay on gave me the idea. So let's look at the name tag on this motor and see what we have. Okay, I'm reaching way around the motor. It's a half horsepower at 5 amp. Remember that, half horsepower, 5 amps. Let's see what Engineering Toolbox has to say about this. Here's a website you should all be familiar with because there's a lot of information here and it's public. It's a chart for single-phase motors, horsepower and full load amps. Here's half horsepower. The half horsepower motor should be drawn about 9.8 amps. 5 amps is what's stated by Grizzly, and that's more of a quarter horsepower motor. So drawing 5 amps, that drill press motor at best is doing a quarter horsepower worth of work, but yet it's marketed at a half horsepower. Let's look at a motor that I have from my motor collection as an example. Boy, this is an old one, but it's a good one. It's made by Packard. Who even knew that they made? Here, a quarter horsepower motor is 4.4 amps. That seems very reasonable, doesn't it? That lines up with the Engineer Toolbox. A far cry from what Grizzly is stating. And also, just physically look at the size of these motors. Let's go measure the Grizzly. Here's the Grizzly half-horse motor, and it's roughly 6 inches long. Now remember, this is it's now a capacitor start, capacitor run motor because I added this device, but about 6 inches long is the physical size. Yeah, well, look how much bigger the old Packard. And I mean, this motor is from the 50s, so it's extremely well built. But just look at the difference in horsepower and amp rating. Let's go downstairs and look at a half-horse motor from my collection, and then let's look at a Delta drill press. Here are some motors from my motor collection. I have a pretty decent motor collection. Let's look at this guy for a second. Here's a half-horsepower motor. Draws 8.8 amps. And let's just look at the size of him. Let me get significantly larger. Okay, let's move over one. Here's another half horsepower. This is a true half horsepower motor. If you live on a farm, guarantee you want this motor. Half horsepower, but in fairness, this is ball bearing, it's severe duty. You can see why I would have kept this motor back in the day when motors were kind of free. Service factor amp of 7.8. So here's a half horsepower motor, 7.8. Let's go back to engineering toolbox and see how that lines up. So again, half horsepower motor in the 9.8. Now that motor was a little bit lower because of the high service factor that the motor has. Okay, so we're going to give Grizzly a D- on that one. Let's go to Delta once and see. Here's a Delta benchtop, and I have to sneak all the way around to try to get to the motor. And he claims he's a 3rd horsepower at 6.5 amps. Okay, let's go to the engineer's toolbox and see what we think about that. Here we go, 3rd horsepower, 7.2. Okay, this old Delta seems pretty reasonable. That's acceptable. I give Delta a good grade for this. Let's look at a different 3rd horsepower motor once, just for reference. Here's another oldie out of my collection, and you can see why I kept these motors. These are really good motors. And let's find the horsepower. 1/3 and 5.4 amps. Why did I keep this motor from 1950s? Look at the service factor on this sucker. It's a good motor. Okay, so there was an example of something older and something maybe a touch newer, something that's pretty close to accurate, being this Delta, and something that isn't even very accurate at all, the Grizzly. Let's just go to the Grizzly catalog for a second while we're on drill presses, then we'll move on to bandsaws. My 2024 catalog. And yes, I buy a lot of Grizzly equipment. Here's probably the closest thing to the old drill press that I have. Oh wait, turn the page. I'm sorry, I started out on the wrong page. This one, President Special, Especial del Presidente, in the off chance that I have any Spanish-speaking viewers. They claim 1/3 horsepower, 1/3 horsepower at 2.3 amps. Okay, let's go to engineering toolbox and see what a 3rd horsepower. 3rd horsepower is 7.2. 2.3 amps isn't even on this chart, so it'd be less than a 1/6 horsepower motor. Okay, Grizzly, you didn't score very high. And it gets worse. Here's some from Shop Fox, must be another brand that they have. Half horsepower motor they claim on this sucker, 5 amps. Let's go look at a half horsepower motor. Let me show you what a half horsepower motor really looks like. Well, it's this one that I've shown already. Half horsepower, service factor amp, 7.8. Yeah, which motor would you rather have on a drill press? Just tell me. Let's go look in the catalog. It gets even better. Okay, here's the one that I'd like to have out in the workshop. So if Grizzly were to ever send me something, please send me this one. I like this one because it goes down to 300 and some RPM, and it'd be good for hole saws. Can I focus on that? There it is. 3/4 horsepower at 7.5 amps. Okay, let's go to engineering toolbox. 3/4 horsepower is more in the 13 amp range. Do we really believe that this one has a 3/4 horsepower motor on it? No, I really don't. But Grizzly, if you want me to field test this one for you, please send me one. Let's go look at a true 3/4 horse motor once. I know there are people jumping up and down for this motor, but you're not going to get it. It just sits on my shelf. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. This is a 3/4 horse, but this is an industrial motor. And you couldn't expect a drill press to have this motor on it. But damn, would it be nice if it did. 10.8. Now this is a nice motor. Everything about this motor is heavy duty. There's a farmer somewhere today that needs this motor bad. It's a beautiful motor. But do we really believe that Especial del Presidente has a 3/4 horse motor at 7.5 amps? No, because at 7.5 amps, it's more of a 1/3 horsepower motor, not 3/4. Okay, let's keep the show on the road here. Let's go talk about drill presses. Let's look at Delta and Grizzly. Let's look at an older Delta and a newer Delta. Let's see what the difference is. Okay, let's go start with the Grizzly, because this Grizzly is going to get B plus A minus, one of my favorite tools. So here we go, a 9-inch Grizzly benchtop bandsaw. I use this thing daily. I love it. It's my go-to. Everything's good about it. I don't think Grizzly sells it anymore though. So this is pretty old. Oh, excuse me. This one's not too old. Maybe 20 years. Let's look at this motor. Notice though, made in Taiwan. That might mean something. Claims he's half horsepower. Claims he's 10 amp. All right, you know where we're going. Back to engineer toolbox. Half horsepower, 10 amps. Engineering toolbox is 9.8. Grizzly's right on the money with that one. A plus. I love Grizzly for that bandsaw. It's my go-to bandsaw. Couldn't be better. Let's look at Delta bandsaws. Here's a new one. Got this one about 20 years ago. Let's see what he says here. Well, first of all, notice that. That might have something to do with it. Horsepower, 1/3 horsepower. Let me focus a little bit better here. 3 amps. I'm sorry, I laughed a little bit there. I shouldn't do that. 3 amps, 1/3 horsepower. Okay, let's go back to the horsepower or to the motor collection. This is a 1/3 motor, 1/3 horsepower. And 1/3, according to Engineering Toolbox, is in the 7.2 amp range. Delta, you get a D minus for that one. Okay, let's look at this one. This one's about 30 years old. I like this one. And the motor's kind of hard to get to at this one. Focus, please. Look where it's manufactured. And what does he say? Can I get it in there? 1/5. 1/5 horsepower. Where's the amp draw? 2.5. This thing isn't anything too powerful, but boy, have I ever made a lot of stuff on this one. 1/5 horsepower. Let's go to engineering toolbox. Well, 1/5 isn't on the table at 2 amps. So that one's a little bit low even. The horsepower is probably, the work you're getting out of that motor is a little bit less than 1/6. They say 1/5, but that's not too bad. That's pretty good. They were pretty truthful back in the day. So the old Delta is pretty truthful. The new Delta, not very truthful at all. The old Grizzly, right on. And we won't even talk vacuum cleaners, because you remember the old Craftsman vacuum cleaners that always said they developed like 6 horsepower or something stupid like that. That was just plain getting ripped off. This is a Porter cable. It draws 8 amps. This thing will suck the carpet right off the floor when the filter is clean. Yes, I have a carpeted woodworking shop. It's a nice thing, especially when you drop a rotor bit on the floor. Well, how do we conclude this video? It's already 15 minutes long. Do we conclude by saying buyer beware? Do you agree with me that there's a little bit of misrepresentation in marketing? Again, we won't say getting ripped off. And by the way, I looked at catalogs for other companies. I went to Home Depot, I went to Menards, I looked at other brands of these benchtop drill presses is what I was looking at. They all seem the same. So I think we just end with buyer beware. When you're out shopping, don't just look at horsepower. Look at the amp draw rating. And if you need to, go to a place like Engineering Toolbox and look at what a horsepower rating should be for amp draw. Well, time to end this video. I'm going to put my motors back on the shelf, and there they'll sit for another, well, all of these have been sitting for at least 30 years on my shelf, just waiting for a project. And I have some woodworking to do today, and I'm going to use my beloved Delta, and we're going to go to work. So I'm wishing you a great day in your shop. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.